Here's me answer to the question. And so, why should universities, first why, we'll come on to how in a bit, why should universities engage with the public? Well, the first reason is because we have to, and I'll unpack that in a bit. The second reason is, and it's actually the reason that most of us who get involved in it start with, because we ought to, not just because we have to. It's not just contractual obligation or something like that. It's because we should. And finally, because it helps, I would argue, it helps us do our jobs better. So looking at the because we have to one first, let's think about that a bit. The fact is, I've thought about all sorts of universities, and I've yet to think of a university or looked at its history in any way and come up with a university that wasn't originally founded, to some extent at least, to serve public need. And a crucial thing which seems to have been overlooked throughout the time I've spent in universities till very recently, our universities are charities. We're formally charities. Our very existence, therefore, is to deliver public benefit, but that's been comprehensively forgotten throughout the sector to a very large extent. You hear people saying, our university is a business like any other. No, it bloody isn't. It's a business like any other charity, but not like any other. So our business, yeah, we're like other businesses, but the ones we resemble are not-for-profit charitable organisations and not the rest, right? And finally, as if the first two weren't enough, a large proportion of the funding that we get in our universities comes from the public purse. So the public have got every right to ask, what do we get out of this deal? We're putting money in here. What do we get out of it? So that's the sort of the because we have to bit, the contractual obligation bit. What about because we ought to? Well, I think that we ought to because we in universities are privileged. I was at a lecture by Noam Chomsky last month, and he said that intellectuals, when you think about it, are intrinsically privileged. You know, it's nice work compared to a lot of work. And we can only do that because other people are doing all the other stuff that we rely on in order to sit around and pontificate. Not that I do much of that, like, as you can imagine, but, you know. So I agree with Chomsky. Intellectuals are intrinsically privileged. And whichever belief system you want to choose, solidarity with those less privileged than ourselves is a very widespread ethic. It's certainly one that I sign up to. I come from a Catholic background. The thing is as well, I think universities, because we've got a lot of bright people who are brought together in a learning community, and I think the best universities are lifelong learning communities in and of themselves. We never stop learning. And, you know, we might be doing teaching, but we need to learn to teach, and it's endless. Because we've got all these brains gathered in the privileged position of grappling with interesting problems, we are a force to be reckoned with. And we've got in our hands the means to contribute to social transformation. And I thoroughly sign up to the notion that education is a very liberating, empowering and rewarding thing. Just on that point, here's a quote from one of my favourite thinkers and writers on education. But here's what he's saying: education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or else it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. And for me, that when I talk about university as a learning community, it's the second part of that quotation I have in mind. It's about giving people the ability to think critically and creatively. And it's a hell of a privilege that we have to be in a position to do that within the formal and informal structures of our society. Moving on to the third point of why. We should do it because it helps us do our jobs better. Here's a quotation from our own Vice-Chancellor, who has a very colourful past. Before he came to Newcastle, his job was trying to turn the university, which was the intellectual powerhouse of apartheid, into an inclusive institution. Academics, I'd say, are very good at framing arguments, but we have no monopoly whatsoever on insight. And this insight comes from a wide range of perspectives. So we might be good at helping people think creatively and critically, but we don't have a monopoly on anything else. So moving on a bit more briefly then, how should universities engage with the public? Well, my answer to this is that it's through the day job, really. So engagement isn't another bloody thing that we have to add to the list. So through our teaching, through our research, and if our work's going to be fruitful, it will be fruitful because we frame the questions which research answers in collaboration with others, with those other voices I've spoken about. So certainly as far as the University of Newcastle is concerned, we say there's no such thing as third strand. We want rid of the phrase third strand. It's not an additional burden, right? It's a critical approach to how we do the day job. So even when we're doing undoubted public service work like clinical practice, it's inextricably bound up with learning, teaching, research and so on. And if it isn't, actually we shouldn't be doing it. Now, this is a common objection. All right, this is all very well, Paul, very nice, touchy-feely, all the rest of it, but it doesn't apply to my discipline. People are always saying, yeah, I agree with you, mate, but it's not for me. Well, we've already come to this point about education being the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality. And if there is any discipline in the university for which critical thinking is not the stock in trade, then we should abolish it. It shouldn't be in the bloody university. And I would argue that critical thinking being applicable to the full range of human experience, it's a generic skill which any discipline on any subject can be used to exemplify and illustrate and so on. And I just don't think it's good enough to say it doesn't apply to my discipline. We have people in our we did a big survey of engagement in our university. Thought I got a couple of hundred returns. We got 1,200. And you wouldn't believe where they came from. Lots of departments that you think they're pretty pure. We're not going to get much from them. Avalanches of great stuff. If you think seriously about this, you can do a lot of good stuff. Because the basic thing that we can bring to the rest of society is critical thinking. Right, I'm nearly done. Here's a question that I sometimes bother myself to think about. Do you think it's fair when people talk about the ivory tower, when they say, oh, bloody academics in their ivory towers? Okay, well, I'm kind of on the yes side of this, despite being in a university that likes to pride itself on being a civic university. But if it is still a fair jibe, I think the question we need to ask is, which side are you on? And with that, I shall hand over to Jerry.